Shalom, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Next week, this time is the beginning of Pesach. Seems like it was just here, but it's here again. This week is the second week of the study of Leviticus. And as I told you before, it's not my easiest, favoriteest book of all of them. So I decided this time I was going to spend some time talking about little things, mysteries. And so I began to sit down and think about some of the mysteries that are found in the book. I don't know. I know Bobby uses it. I don't know how many of you use the Humash, whatever you want to call it. The Humash is the first 5 books and the commentary that goes with it. But I don't know how many of you noticed that at the end of every Parsha, there's a short, small, tiny little line. And that tiny little line at the end has some interesting words. You know, you can't read it in English because in English it's not. They don't have it in the English language. So you have to basically understand a little Hebrew to figure out what's going on. But what it does is it tells us exactly how many verses are actually in a particular parsha, and it doesn't seem like much until all of a sudden you begin to look at the text and well, I'll get there. Let me start over. So it basically gives you a number of verses. Now that number of verses can be transposed or translated into a word. And because every number suggests another word. And so for this week, the word that's suggested is the word Sav. So Sav has 138 verses. So it shows us that same word, but not for yet. So in the publication then, an easy example would be the one Ross and I have been talking about indirectly, and that's the idea of Noah. The Parsha of Noah there contains 123 verses. Well, 123 doesn't mean anything unless you look at the gematria of the word. And again, the gematria of a word, there are many possibilities. But one of the ones that the sages have identified is the possibility that the word could be Betzalel. What's Betzalel? Well, we know that first off that Noah built an ark in order to sustain his family across a catastrophe, to say the least. Now, in this ark, then, he and his family were kept safe. Now, the word Betzalel is the same word that means shadow of God. So when they went into the ark, they went under the shadow of God. Betzalel took the meaning of his name tells us that he understood not only the numbering system, the gematria, but he also knew how to construct the furniture based upon the number. And so but his name really was Betzalel ben Uri, which means Betzalel, son of Uri. He understood that his name was the son under the shadow of God, and that he himself would build an ark. Hint after hint. Now, the second one that I point to is the next chapter, next parsha, which is Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha has 126 verses. Now, one of the meanings of Lech Lecha, or one of the meanings of the 126 that can be used here, is the word Nimlu. The word Nimlu talks about they were circumcised. That's what it means. They were circumcised. Lo and behold, if you look at Lech Lecha, the very last section of Lech Lecha deals with the circumcision of Abraham and all of his family. Coincidental. Now this week is Sav, so I'll get to Sav. And it's actually, I said 126. It's actually, Sav was 96. But the Jewish sages decided that as they looked at it, Sav was the correct word that they wanted to see from this, because it's going to talk about seeing. Seeing. So there's 96 verses here. I say all that to say this. If you were to go through the chronology of all of the sentences in the Bible, according to whoever you use for a counter, you'll find that there are 5,845 verses in the Bible, which is interesting because the sages tell us that's not right. And by telling us that it's not 5,845, they instead tell us it's 5,888. And they come by that by the Talmudic passage that's in Kedushin 30a. Because you see, that's where it tells us that that's how many verses. So the question is, what happened to 43 verses in the Bible? Now, some people will say, well, that's easy. It just simply means that they rearrange some of the sentences. And so some of them are much shorter, and therefore you gain 43 sentences. And so that's why it's really, today it's only 58:45, but back then it was 58:88. But there was a lot of other controversy going on at that time. And there was a man who really, well, he was controversial to say the least. He, well, maybe I should remind you, how do we determine a verse in the Bible? Who established verses? Who established chapters? We say it happened in the early 15th century. Gutenberg's press established a lot of things. And it was the Anglican priest who actually established chapter and verse. Well, we know the chapter and verses in the King James are not the same as the chapters and verse in the Tanakh. First off, we know that Malachi has only 3 chapters if you're reading it in Hebrew, but it has 4 chapters if you're reading it in English. So as we go through, there's differences that are going to be occurring. But these differences have an understanding. There was a man, a rabbi. Actually, he was a Hasidic rabbi. He actually was a Kabbalistic rabbi. In fact, he had actually started an organization dealing with that concepts of the Bible that were based on the Zohar. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Hazid. Again, he was in the 12th century, even before they began to write the laws down on a printer. And he looked at the text and he says, well, that's easy to understand. There are 2 places where David got involved in the Torah. Now, David didn't live in the time of the Torah, but David had an effect on the Torah. His effect on the Torah was in such that Rabbi Yehuda said, look at chapter 21 of the book of Numbers. And if you looked at chapter 21 in the book of Numbers, you're going to find out it deals with the battles between Israel, led by Moses, and Og and Sihon, 2 of the kings that were on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Well, these 2 kings then, by the 17th verse, it says that at this point in time, there was a song that was sung, a song that related to this whole issue of what was going on the defeating of Og and Sihon. Well, in the process of looking at that, we find that Rabbi Yehuda actually found, he says, if you really want to understand where they're at, you need to go to the book of Psalms and go to chapter 136, which is called the Great Hallel. Well, the Great Hallel deals a lot with Og and Sihon, and it is a song. So Rabbi Yehuda said, here's where we go. When we're short verses, we need to look to, and in this case, Psalm 136. And if you take those verses, those 26 verses, and put them back where they belong in the book of Numbers, what you're going to find is that there's a change. And it's closer to what it is, but it was still not the same. But 26 left us another gematria. 26 left us the name Yud-Keh-Vav-Keh, the Hashem. So he said, understand then, David didn't write Psalm 136. Psalm 136 was borrowed. Now you're still 17 verses short. So the question then became, where did the other 17 come from? Or where was it lost in? Well, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he looked at this and he said, we need to go and look someplace else, but we need to stay in the Psalms. Now, it was in the idea of the Zohar that we come up with this interesting understanding. They pointed out in the Zohar the inconsistencies that are in the scriptures, the fact that the systems do not line up. But at the same time, they said the reason why is because of the king. Now, they didn't mean king necessarily. They meant a scholar. It was the scholars who began to take a look at the text and created such a text that there's a little slight differences, misunderstandings that can be found within the text itself. Things would be cleared up if you understood the translator in these particular cases. In fact, there was one scripture, Solomon wrote about it. It's in the book of in the book of Proverbs, and it's Proverb 25:2. He says, the honor of God is to conceal the Devar, whereas the honor of kings is to search out the Devar. Now, the question is, in my Bible, it says things. So the text would say the honor of God was to conceal the thing. Or whereas the honor of kings was to search out the things. But you see, things is only one way to look at the word Devar. Devar also means speech or word. So if I changed that things to word, notice the difference that I have in the text. The honor of God is to conceal a word, whereas the honor of kings is to search out a word. A word. Now, when it says kings here, kings can mean kings, but kings will also mean in the Zohar, means those who are righteous readers of the scriptures, the scholars, those who study. So what we're looking at then is the fact that it's the scholars who are going to penetrate this. And Rabbi Yehuda was probably one of the greatest scholars of his day. The only problem was he lived in a world where they didn't want to accept the fact that the Bible might be tampered with. And so his writings were hidden away. Nobody was allowed to see them. Well, in about the 15th century, there was another rabbi who ran across his writings and he began to speak to those. But again, the establishment wasn't ready to listen to that. So his writings were put away again, off the charts. Now, in understanding then, we're still missing 17 verses. Those 17 verses could be found in the book of Psalms, in Psalm number 19. You see, Psalm 19 is where David is dealing with what appears to be someone who is blind, hiding the words, hiding the words. In Hebrew, not like English, we talk about the fact that there's spiritual understanding behind every word in English. But in Hebrew, there's 4 levels of understanding. Peshat, which is the simplest level. Then you have what is called remez, which is those things that are hidden within a text, not easily seen. But even more, you have to continue to dig, and you go to the 3rd level, which is drosh, which is the idea of you threshing through it, going to the deepest areas. And then finally, you have what's called sod, the mystical. Together, those four letters create the word paradis, or the word we know as paradise. And so a scholar is one who is searching for paradise. He's searching to unscramble the text in order to make it make sense where he's at. Now, in Midrash Tahalim 3 in the Torah, it simply says that what is written in its proper order and all the puzzling pieces were to be seen. But then if it were, everyone could read it and everyone could know the end. And so God, in his wisdom, took things out of chronological order. David, in his understanding, felt the need to eliminate some of the text from the scriptures in order to make it more confusing. And in order to solve those problems, one have to study. Rabbi Huda understood the fact that there was going to be these 46 missing verses, or 43 missing verses that had been extracted from the Torah. And he also looked at the 10 Psalms that Moses was supposed to speak. And when he looked at those Psalms, he says, well, wait a second. There's one Psalm dealing with Shabbat. But it wasn't written from Moses' point of view. It was written from Adam's point of view. So one of the texts that Adam was speaking, or that Moses said he was speaking, was really Adam who was talking to us. So as we look at all of the Psalms and we look at everything that's there, one has to understand the fact that those 43 missing verses are still in the scriptures. They're just not easily found. They're not in the place where we thought they would be or should be. But they were done on purpose. There was a reason for it. You know, last week I talked to you about the fact that there were two significant sacrifices we should pay attention to. The first of those two sacrifices was called the Olah, or the burnt offering, the offering that rises up. The second offering I talked about was Hatat. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time because I knew Rod was going to talk about them the next day. So I just simply mentioned them to you and gave you an understanding, but those were the two most significant ones. Our story in Parsha today begins in that same vein, because we're going to look at, for just a little bit, I want to take a look at Leviticus chapter 6, and I want to look at those first 6 verses, because you see those first 6 verses deal with one of our two offerings that we have to pay attention to. Now we're going to talk about the easiness of understanding those two texts. But I'm also going to talk to you about the depth of those two texts, or of this text. So let's begin. Now I took my notes from, not from the Bible that I have here, but I took my notes from Rabbi Ari Kaplan, who wrote what I guess would best be called a living Bible. His text is more literal than any of the others. And so I really went after the accuracy. So my words might look a little different than yours, but I want you to follow along. Now, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the elevation or the burnt offerings. Also, we could have used the word Olah. That is the burnt offering that stays upon the mokdah. Mokdah is the word for flame. On the altar all night until morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept aflame on it. And the Cohen shall don his linen tunic, and he shall don his linen trousers on his flesh. And he shall lift out the ashes into which the fire had consumed the burnt offering upon the altar, and put them down next to the altar. He shall then take off his garments and put on other garments, and he shall take out the ashes to a clean place outside the camp. Now the fire on the altar shall burn on it, and it shall not go out. The Cohen shall kindle wood upon it every morning, and upon it he shall arrange the burnt offering and cause the fats of the peace offering to go up in smoke upon it. A continuous fire shall burn upon the altar, and it shall not go out. Okay. It's a little bit different. I hope you could follow along with your text. But my point of this is, first off, for Mike, we have a word in that second verse that's different. The word's mokda, which means flame. But if you go to the Hebrew side, you'll notice right away that there's something wrong with the way it was written. You'll find there that there is a small mem that starts the word. And so the mem then becomes the subject of what is it that we're supposed to begin to understand from the text. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the mem. So mem means fire or means flame. But if you look at a mem also speaks of water. Not fire so much, but water. Water in Hebrew is ma'im. Ma'im speaks to me of the Torah. So what does a flame have to do with Torah? Where did they go? How did they fit together? Well, there was a man named Rabbi Menachem Mendel from Kotsk who explained that the small mem means that the fire of the Torah must be kept burning within our hearts, within the heart of every student, within our hearts. Now, the fire of Torah then would be the water, ma'im. But this fire is supposed to be kept burning internally. Now, this fire is to be more specific. It was not just simply for an outward sign, but it was about promotion of humility. Because this fire is not supposed to be shown as much outwardly as inwardly. And like in Vayikra and the little aleph, we now have a little mem. We're now talking about humility. That's the idea. So one should study earnestly, but in their study, they should not become braggadocious about all that they've learned and how much they know, how much better off they are than the other person. Their understanding is to help others, but it's only help when it's given by the receiver wanting the help, not any other way. Now, if you notice, there's two mems. There's the open mem, which is the mem that starts this word, and then there's the closed mem. The open mem is found anywhere from the first letter of a word all the way through the word until the end of the word. And the last letter, if it's a mem, is closed. It's a box. There's nothing that can get in or out. But there is in the case of the open mem in the beginning. So as we look at these two things, I want us to understand the fact that the closed mem being found at the end is also a hint of something, just as the open mem at the beginning and the middle is also a hint of something. Now, it all goes back to the secrets of understanding your soul and the soul of Torah. Because you see, for the Kabbalist, each letter gives us an understanding. Now, sometimes you have to go way far beyond the normal to really understand the depths by which these things are. And being a Gentile, trying to explain to you the depths of the Hebrew is like me trying to explain to you how a transmission on a car works. I never took any mechanic classes. I can't help you there at all. But anyway, the idea here is the fact that the closed or the open mem talks about today, life today. You see, life today is open, and it's open to lots of things. It's open to everything that's under the sun. The only problem is everything under the sun isn't good for us. In fact, sometimes sun isn't good for us. But the idea is the fact that in the world we live in, we can receive almost anything. And it's our responsibility to fire through, to purge that which is not good for us. But to purge that which is not good for us requires us to know what's not good for us. Now, when we went through these 6 verses, they had several verses which are positive. Do this, do that. They were commanded. But it also ended up telling us at the very end, when it was all said and done, the fire shall be continual. Meaning that we should continually go back. Now, there are those that we know that don't study the Bible. In fact, I used to call them in church Christmas cookies and Easter bunnies, because those were the days in which they would manage to show up at church and they would be waiting for a good message, and then that would carry them for the next 6 months. But that's beside the point. The point is, in Hebrew, to learn even a little is to be gain, because it's then at that point in time that you have something you can build upon, that you can have to change. Now, eventually, all the mems will be closed, according to the rabbis. Because you see, they will close because perfection will be found inside and imperfection, evil, will be found outside. God will surround us, box us in, so to speak. When will that come? That will come with a large mem, the Mashiach. He'll bring it about at that point in time. Until then, we're supposed to occupy ourselves with fire. I didn't have time to teach this, so I'm just going to give you a synopsis, and maybe sometime I'll come back to it. It's not in anybody's notes, so you're just going to have to listen. Now, for some of you, you've been in my class before, and you know the word Bereshit, first word of the Bible. You know, any 6-letter word in Hebrew can be permutated, changed. And according to the rabbis, the word Bereshit has 6 letters, and therefore it could be translated or transposed 620 different ways. Now, you and I would never be able to do that, but they can, because they find that there are 70 different ways to attack a word. And so depending on how. But 620 is also a very familiar number, because you see 620 is the number of 613, the laws of the Hebrews, and 7 laws of Noah. So by coincidence, then, we have our first understanding that's beyond the level of Peshat. But if you had the word Bereshit in front of you, and if you could open your Bibles to that first page and look at the word Bereshit for a second, maybe it'll help you, and maybe you can glean a little bit about what I'm talking about. Now, we already know that the first letter there is a large bet. I want you to look and notice it's Bet, Resh, Aleph, Shin, Yud, Tav. Now we're going to permutate that. We're going to change that into 2 words and not 1. And what I want you to do is I want you to take the first 2 letters and the last 2 letters and put them together. Do you see a word? The word is Brit. What does Brit mean? Brit means covenant. Now, what are the 2 middle letters mean? Aleph, Shin. That's the word fire. So the beginning, we have a covenant of fire. Now, a covenant of fire is something that the Jewish men, Kabbalists, spend an extensive amount of time talking about. Because remember, we're talking about the fact that we need to keep the fires burning. So a covenant of fire is a covenant by which we continually look and dig for that kind of information. Now, one way to look at this is very simple. Well, maybe not so simple. If we were to look at the word man in Hebrew, Ish, it's Aleph, Yud, Shin. If you were looking at the word woman in Hebrew, you have Isha, which is Aleph, Shin, Hey. Both are 3-letter words, But now let's permutate it. Putting the two together, I want you to take the yud and the hey out. Now you've got the two letters for fire. What does yud and hey stand for? Yah, God. God is in man and woman. God is in us all the way from the very beginning. Now, it also tells us, if we take the word Yah, Yah speaks about the world that we live in, the world of Hazeh. Vav and Hey, the other two letters of his name, speaks of the Olam Haba, the world to come. So when God put us here on this earth, he put us here for the purpose of dealing with this world, to grow from this and to grow in it. Now, God put man in the Garden of Eden, gave him his presence, although his presence was hard to recognize because he never left the garden, but people seemed to think that it wasn't until he started walking that they could recognize that he was there, and that's probably true, but he had been there the whole time. Now, in the book, the Talmud, in the book called Yoma, the word fire is used on 6 occasions. So I want to talk about that for a second. Actually, it's actually here in the text that we just read in Leviticus. 6 times the word flame or fire appears. Is it a coincidence? The answer is no. If I were to take the two letters, Yud and or an Aleph and a Shin, and put them together, I have 301. 301 times 6 is 1806. What does that mean? 1806 is the understanding of Genesis 1 and 2. That's the number of letters. Also, if I were to take 1806, I could divide it out and I could say it's 21 times 86. More numbers. 86 is the word Elohim. Elohim, that's God's name. But it's also the word Teva, which means nature. Chapter 1 is about nature. It's about God putting together nature and judging it, establishing it in the way he would have it to be. Okay. Now there are 6 pairs, if you will, 6 pairs of words or common nouns who use the initials Aleph, Shin. And that's what I want to give you now. Because you see, those are 6 pairs of fire. It's not in any notes I've given you. Eventually, I'll plan on teaching a lesson on it, but right now it's just thoughts coming out of my head. Number 1, Aleph can create the word El. Aleph, Al, Al. The second word using the word Shin is Shaddai. Shaddai. Aleph and Shin makes the name El Shaddai. El Shaddai is going to appear 6 times in the scriptures, only 6. 5 of them will be in the Tanakh or in the Torah. 1 of them will be found in the book of the prophets. I thought that was interesting. But the most interesting fact is that in Genesis chapter 17, the first verse, God is dealing with, this is the first time El Shaddai appears. First time he says, walk before me and be complete. Walk before me and be complete. El Shaddai is asking him to walk before him. That 17th chapter deals with circumcision. Now, the second time that we can use the letters Aleph and Shin is in what we call nothing and something. Ish Ma'in. Ish Ma'in. God created something from nothing. is what it amounts to. The third time we can have that pair of Aleph and Shin, we are talking about Shemaim and Eretz, heaven and earth. And actually, if you go to Genesis chapter 2:4, it's actually earth, Aleph, then Shemaim, Shin. That's a third covenant. The fourth one is when we begin to look at the days of the week. After we create the beginning, the dark, change to light, and all of those things, we have day one. Day one is Ehad, Aleph, Het, Dalet. When we look at day two, we're looking at the word Shini, Shin, Aleph for Hadad, Shin for Shini, fourth pair. The fifth pair is the first two generations of man, Adam and Seth. The last one is the greatest pair in Israel's long list, but it's also in Islam, and it's also in Christianity. Aleph is Avram, Shin is Sarah. The world is built on fire. It's built on understanding things that you hadn't looked at before. It's looking deeper into the texts. It's taking time, like you folks are, to listen to me babble on, talk. But in doing so, hopefully what you're doing is you're putting away knowledge. Now, you may never use any of this, but if you use nothing else, understand that God wants you to be on fire, to burn with the desire to learn, with the desire to understand. That's enough. I can go on and sermonize, but I don't want to do that. Anybody got any questions? Not that I brought up anything that might be questionable, but anybody have any thoughts or questions about the text, the whole Parsha, not just this one